People think the Appalachian Mountains are just rolling hills and scenic trails, peaceful, ancient quiet. But those of us who've spent real time out here know better. There's something buried in these woods, tucked deep in the hollows and between the ridgelines. It watches, it waits, and sometimes it reaches out. These stories aren't about ghost hunters or urban legends. They're first-hand accounts, raw, unnerving moments when the familiar twisted into the unexplainable. You won't find these tales in park brochures or campfire songs. These are the kinds of stories people only tell when they're certain no one's listening, or when they've got nothing left to lose. So if you're planning to explore the Appalachians anytime soon, listen closely, because once the sun goes down, the forest doesn't always let you go. Story 1. The Whispering Forest. I've lived in the Appalachian Mountains nearly my whole life. Born and raised among the misty ridges and dense woods, I came to know their rhythms like the back of my hand. The wind through the branches, the chirp of cicadas at dusk, the distant yips of coyotes echoing across the hollows, all of it familiar, even comforting. I own a modest cabin just off an old gravel road no one really uses anymore. It's the kind of place that feels removed from the rest of the world, quiet, self-sustained, and mostly untouched by time. I have a wood-burning stove, solar panels, and more books than I'll ever finish. And then there's Jax, my golden retriever, my shadow. He's not just a pet, he's a constant presence, the kind of dog who sleeps beside the fireplace like he was born there. He rarely makes a fuss about anything, not even when black bears wander too close to the porch. He's always been calm, steady, grounded. That night started like any other. I spent the evening chopping wood, fixing a busted screen on the window, then settling in for a late dinner. Jax had curled up in his usual spot, tail tucked under his nose, chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Outside, the sky was inky black, stars thick and clear, and the forest was doing what it always did after dark, humming softly with crickets, owls, and rustling leaves. I remember thinking how still everything felt, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. That was just life out here, peaceful, quiet, normal, but looking back now, there was something off in that stillness. Something I didn't catch until it was too late. It started with a sound, not from outside, but from Jax. A low, guttural growl vibrated from deep in his chest, a sound I had never heard from him before. I looked over, expecting him to be dreaming or reacting to some squirrel scurrying across the roof, but he wasn't lying down anymore. He was rigid, standing perfectly still, tail stiff and hackles raised like he was facing down a predator. His eyes were locked on the front window, and that growl, it kept going, steady and low, almost like a warning I wasn't meant to ignore. I followed his gaze, but all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. Nothing moved outside. No shadows, no lights, nothing. "Easy, buddy," I muttered, trying to soothe him, maybe even myself. But the unease had already started crawling under my skin. Jax doesn't react like that unless something is seriously wrong. And when I say wrong, I don't mean a raccoon or a stray dog. I mean danger. I stood up, peered out the window again, and pressed my hand against the cool glass. Still nothing. That's when I remembered I hadn't locked the workshop. It's a small building downhill from the cabin where I keep tools and spare supplies. Normally it wouldn't bother me. I've made that walk in the dark hundreds of times, just a flashlight and a brisk pace. But something about the way Jax was acting made the short trip feel like a trek into the unknown. Still, I didn't want to leave it unsecured. I grabbed my coat, slung my flashlight from its hook, and headed toward the door. Jax bolted to my side before I could even call for him, practically gluing himself to my leg. I didn't tell him to stay behind. Truth was, I didn't want to go alone. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. The air wasn't just cold, it was still. Too still. The kind of still that screams wrong. No chirping, no rustling leaves, not even a breeze brushing through the trees. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the frozen ground. We made our way down the slope slowly, every step sounding louder than it should. Then halfway to the workshop, Jack stopped dead. His head snapped to the left, and another growl poured from his throat, sharper this time, angry. I froze, flashlight, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it. The door to the workshop slightly open. That was impossible. I know I closed it. I always do. It creaked softly as the wind caught it just right, swinging a few inches. My breath caught in my throat. Something was wrong. Something had gone in or come out. My hands were already shaking by the time I reached the door. I pushed it shut, turned the lock, and that's when the forest exploded behind me. It wasn't just a noise. It was a rush, like something massive tearing through the trees. Branches snapped, underbrush crunched, and the sound was everywhere, surrounding us. It didn't sound like a single creature. It sounded like a group, a crowd. My body went stiff with adrenaline. Jax was at my heel, teeth bared, staring wide-eyed into the dark. I fumbled with the flashlight, nearly dropping it. I didn't run, not quite, but I backed away fast, not daring to turn my back to the woods. My legs wanted to sprint, but my instincts told me not to. When we reached the porch, I slammed the door shut behind us and threw the deadbolt. Jack stayed glued to the door, ears perked, growling again. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Whatever was out there, it wasn't gone. It was watching, and I had the horrible feeling that it hadn't just stumbled onto our property by accident. It knew we were here, and it wanted us to know it too. I stood frozen in the hallway, hands still gripping the deadbolt like that flimsy lock could stop whatever had just torn through the forest. Jax hadn't moved from the door. His ears were high, tail tucked, body low, a position I'd only seen once before, during a bad storm that sent a tree crashing near the cabin. But this wasn't wind. This wasn't weather. This was intentional. Something had come close and it wasn't finished. I swallowed hard and whispered Jax's name. He didn't respond, just kept staring, like he was waiting for it to return, and my brain was scrambling to make sense of it. A bear, maybe a group of deer startled by something. But no animal makes a sound like that. Not so many at once, not with that force. It had weight, purpose, and underneath it all was that feeling I couldn't shake, like we were being hunted. I realized my pistol was still upstairs. With my pulse hammering in my throat, I bolted up the steps 2 at a time, grabbed the gun from the nightstand, and loaded it with trembling fingers. I didn't know what I'd do with it, but holding it gave me a threadbare sense of control. That's when Jax barked, a sharp, singular sound that snapped the air like a whip. He doesn't bark unless something is wrong. I crept to the front, door every muscle tight, and eased it open just a crack. Cold air rushed in. I stepped onto the porch, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other, scanning the tree line with a wide, frantic beam. The light hit nothing. Just the empty yard, quiet woods, still shadows. But the silence, it wasn't right. It was oppressive. The kind of silence where you can hear yourself thinking, where you know something is listening back. Then I heard it, not a footstep, not a howl. It was lower than that. A murmur, a hushed, unintelligible babble, rising and falling like the sound of a distant crowd whispering in a language I couldn't place. It didn't come from one place. It came from everywhere. From the trees to the left, then behind me, then the far side of the yard. I turned in a slow circle, flashlight sweeping uselessly through the dark. Nothing. But the voices kept going, weaving together, too soft to understand, too wrong to ignore. Jax whimpered behind me, trying to tug me back inside. That sound, that murmur, and it wasn't human, or at least it wasn't right. It had the rhythm of speech, but none of the content. No emotion. Just sound, unanchored and crawling across the air like static. Then it changed, shifted slightly, like multiple voices trying to harmonize but failing, the cadence bending, upward into something almost melodic, almost chanting. And with that shift, a nausea rolled through me so sudden I had to lean against the porch rail to keep from dropping. My knees buckled, my vision narrowed. I backed toward the door, not daring to turn my back to the woods, and as I reached for the knob, the flashlight flickered. Just once. But in that split second, I thought I saw something at the edge of the trees. A shape, tall, still, wrong. When the light steadied again, it was gone. I slammed the door, bolted it, and turned off every light in the house. Somehow, I thought darkness might hide us, but it didn't stop the murmurs. They grew louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the wall and almost recoiled. The voices were inside the walls. Not literally, but they felt that close. I paced from window to window, careful not to rustle the curtains, flashlight off, pistol tight in my hand. Every time I moved, the murmuring paused, then resumed, agitated. It was like they were responding. To me, waiting for movement, feeding off it. Time blurred. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. It had barely been an hour, but it felt like days. The house creaked and moaned, and I could swear I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crunching, across the gravel. One step, a pause, another. Then silence. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how many of them there were or what they wanted. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not alone. And whatever had come out of those woods, it wasn't leaving. The hours that followed didn't pass so much as they crawled. I sat in the dark, back pressed against the cold wall, pistol resting on my lap, every nerve strung tight like wire. Jax paced the living room with low whines, ears flicking at every creak and groan the house made. Outside, the murmuring continued, a shifting tapestry of whispers and faint footfalls that drifted from one side of the house to the other in a slow, deliberate orbit. At times I thought they were gone, only for the voices to surge again, closer, more agitated. There were no lights, no shadows moving behind curtains, no knock on the door, just presence, a sense of being observed, surrounded, measured, around. 4:30, something shifted. I noticed it first in the air, lighter somehow. Then the murmurs began to fade, their strange cadence lowering into something barely audible, like breath carried away by the wind. I crept toward a window and parted, the curtain by a sliver. Nothing. The yard lay in eerie stillness, but not the suffocating kind I'd felt before. This was emptier, like something had left. The moment I realized the whispers were truly gone, I collapsed into the armchair, not from relief, but exhaustion. I hadn't slept, hadn't dared to blink too long. And even now, as the first streaks of dawn bled across the horizon, my body refused to relax. When I finally stepped outside, the world felt wrong in its normalcy. The ground bore no footprints. The trees stood still and ordinary. There was no damage, no evidence that anything had ever been there. Only broken twigs where Jax and I had stumbled back up the slope, and the faint smell of disturbed soil. But the house felt different. My home at the place I built for peace and quiet had been pierced, violated. It no longer felt safe. Whatever had come to visit didn't want to be seen, didn't need to be. It had simply wanted me to know it could, reach me, that it knew I was there, and that somehow felt worse than anything I could have seen with my own eyes. Story 2. The Vanishing Figures on the Road. I've always been drawn to places that feel forgotten, the kinds of locations you won't find in travel guides, tucked deep in the folds of old maps and even older stories. That's how I ended, up at Holly River State Park in West Virginia, with two close friends on a grey autumn morning, chasing a rumor more than a destination. We'd heard about a hidden family cemetery somewhere along the ridgeline. No official trail, no signs, just whispers passed between hikers and a few old-timers who claimed it had been there since the 1800s. That mystery was exactly our kind of day trip. We packed light, filled thermoses with coffee, and piled into my car just after sunrise. The drive was quiet in the way only backroads can be. Long stretches of forest hemming us in on both sides, fog hanging low like a warning. We cracked a few jokes, mostly to break the stillness, but even with the sun creeping higher, I couldn't shake a knot in my gut. I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe just that weird in-between mood when excitement and unease blur together. When we pulled into the near-empty trailhead lot, we didn't see another soul. That struck me as odd. Holly River isn't exactly a secret, and the weather, though overcast, wasn't bad. Still, we shrugged it off and figured everyone else had already started their hikes. We were a little late, after all. Looking back, I wonder if we were the only ones because others already knew better. There was a hush in that forest that didn't match the time of day. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. We started walking anyway, chasing shadows and stories we didn't yet understand. The trail started out easy enough, a worn dirt path meandering beneath a canopy of towering hardwoods and moss-covered boulders. For a while, the only sounds were our boots crunching on leaves and the occasional distant bird call. But as we moved deeper into the forest, even those began to fade. Our conversation dwindled to a murmur, and then silence altogether. Not because we had nothing to say, but because something about the woods demanded our attention. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, every flicker of motion at the edge of our vision had us glancing over our shoulders. There was no one else around. That much we were certain of. And yet, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, thick with the kind of quiet that hums just behind your ears, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After nearly an hour of hiking, we left the marked trail to follow what could generously be called a game path. More rumor than route, winding uphill through a tangled mess of undergrowth and roots. My arms were scratched, my legs sore, and still we pressed on, drawn by some unspoken agreement that we had to find the graveyard. It felt like we were chasing something we dreamed about but couldn't name. Eventually, we spotted it, the edge of an old rusted iron gate, nearly swallowed by the trees. Beyond it, a cluster of crumbling headstones leaned at awkward angles, names barely legible beneath centuries of wear. The air was musty, laced with the scent of damp leaves and something older, something like decay. We spread out, taking pictures and brushing aside vines, half in awe, half uneasy. There was a strange stillness that seemed to settle over the clearing as if the forest was standing guard. We didn't speak much while we were there, and when we finally left, the sun had already dipped low behind the ridge, casting long purple shadows through the trees. We hadn't planned to hike in the dark, but time had slipped away from us. With nightfall creeping in, we figured the quickest way back to the car would be to cut across the park's main road, a long winding stretch of asphalt that looped toward the campground parking lot. The forest behind us felt like it was exhaling as we stepped away. I remember glancing back at the cemetery once, and even though it looked the same as before, I had this sudden, vivid sense that something had noticed us there, something that wasn't quite ready to let us go. The road was a welcome sight at first, smooth even, open to the dimming sky. After an hour of climbing over roots and dodging thorns, asphalt felt like civilization. We let out nervous laughs, the kind that cover up relief, and started walking, estimating we had maybe 2 or 3 miles left to the campground. The air felt different on the road, thinner somehow, like the trees had leaned back just enough to give us space. But it wasn't long before we noticed how quiet it really was. No cars passed, no animals called from the woods, no wind stirred the leaves. Just the soft thump of our boots and the rhythm of our breathing. The sun had bled away entirely now, leaving behind a sky stuck in that eerie half-light, not quite night, but far from day. And that's when we saw them. Up ahead, maybe 40 or 50 yards down the road, stood a group of figures. 5 at least, maybe 6, just standing there, shoulder to shoulder, completely still. We stopped walking. I remember the 3 of us exchanging quick looks, that same flicker of relief flashing across our faces. People, finally. But something was off. None of them moved. They didn't speak, didn't shift weight or adjust posture. They just stood. They're like cutouts. My friend raised a hand and gave a small wave. Nothing, no reaction. We called out cautiously at first. A simple hey, then a louder, "You guys okay?" Still nothing. We walked forward slowly, hesitant but drawn in by the need to explain what we were seeing. As we got closer, I realized I couldn't make out any of their features. No faces, no defining details. Just outlines in the twilight, heads, shoulders, the vague suggestion of arms. Like shadows dressed up as people. It wasn't just the fading light. It was like the space around them bent, refused to clarify. And then, without any warning, they began to fade. Not all at once. One by one. The figure on the left shimmered faintly, then simply wasn't there anymore. The second followed, then the third. By the time the last one vanished, we were only 20 feet away. Nothing dramatic, no sound, no smoke. They just blinked out. Gone. We stood frozen, staring at the now empty stretch of road, our breath hanging in the cold air. There was nowhere for them to have gone. One side of the road dropped into a steep ravine, the other rose into a wall of jagged rock and dense brush. No paths, no crunch of leaves, no scurrying feet, just absence. We crept forward, scanning the ground, searching for something, anything. A footprint, a piece of clothing, a cough from the woods. But there was nothing. The road looked untouched, save for our own steps. One of my friends whispered, "Did we all see that?" And we knew we had. But the more we stood there, the more surreal it began to feel. Like maybe it had happened in a different layer of reality, one that was already slipping through our fingers. We shined our phone lights in every direction, hearts pounding now, panic rising like a tide. I don't know what we were hoping to find, or maybe we were just desperate not to be left alone in that silence. We didn't talk much as we moved forward again. The mood had shifted completely. What was once a casual, if eerie, hike had twisted into something else. Something wrong. Every few steps I caught myself glancing behind us, half expecting those shadowy forms to return, to reform in the distance and begin following. But the road stayed empty, unnaturally so. The farther we walked, the more the dark pressed in, like it was trying to squeeze the memory out of us, or maybe make sure we never told anyone what we saw. The forest to either side felt closer than before, the trees looming, their branches reaching in like hands. I had the sense we had stepped over some unseen boundary, that we had seen something not meant for us, and now the woods were trying to decide what to do with us. When we finally reached the campground, it didn't feel like a return to safety, more like surfacing from underwater, only to realize the air still felt wrong. The lot was silent, the campsites empty, not even the distant flicker of a fire or the low murmur of conversation. Usually, even in the off-season, you'd hear something, a dog barking, a car door slamming, a late-night laugh. But that night, the whole place felt abandoned. Our car sat exactly where we left it, bathed in pale moonlight, a strange island of familiarity in a place that no longer felt real. We climbed in without a word, slammed the doors shut, and locked them immediately, not because we thought someone was coming, but because we didn't want whatever we'd seen to follow. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, headlights washing over trees that now looked unfamiliar, as if the forest had rearranged itself in our absence. It wasn't until we hit the highway, until we were miles away, wrapped in the glow of gas stations and rest stops and signs pointing to places with names, that we started to speak. Theories flew, tricks of the fading light, mass hallucination, maybe some local group messing with us. But none of those ideas explained the silence, the vanishing, or how our bodies had reacted before our minds could catch up. That primal, full-bodied dread that doesn't come from imagination. That night stayed with us. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing down long stretches of empty road, half expecting those silhouettes to return. Not moving, not threatening, just waiting. Some stories don't need a ghost to be terrifying. Sometimes it's the unanswered questions that haunt you. And that night in Holly River left us with more questions than we knew what to do with. All I know is this: those figures were real, we saw them. And wherever they went, I hope we never find that road again. Story 3. Blood Mountain Ghosts. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail solo for a little over 2 weeks when I first reached the foothills of Blood Mountain. It was the kind of place that carried weight, not just the kind your legs feel, from steep climbs, but the kind that sinks into your chest. The name alone conjured images of something grim, and once I started reading about its history, the feeling only deepened. Civil War skirmishes, ancient tribal conflicts, disappearances, all tucked away beneath dense forest and winding switchbacks. I'd always had a fascination with the past, especially places where history seemed to hang thick in the air. Blood Mountain had that in spades. It didn't just feel old, it felt remembered, like the land itself hadn't let go of what it had witnessed. That day the weather had turned cold and grey, with fog curling low across the ridges. I planned to camp just off the main trail near a small clearing I'd seen marked in a guidebook. It wasn't much, a flat spot beside a ridge with enough cover to keep out the wind. I set up my hammock between 2 thick trees, brewed a quick meal over a camp stove, and settled in as night fell faster than expected. I figured it would be like any other night I'd spent out there, quiet, a little lonely, maybe a bit spooky if I let my imagination wander too far. But something about the silence was heavier than usual. Even the night chorus of crickets and owls seemed hesitant. I remember lying back, staring through gaps in the canopy at a moon smeared by cloud and thinking, this place doesn't feel empty. I didn't know why at the time. I just knew I wasn't the only one out there. It started with movement, not in front of me, but just outside the edge of my vision. Flickers of shape in the corners of my eyes that vanished when I turned my head. I chalked it up to fatigue. Hiking for days without proper rest messes with your senses. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was circling the clearing. Not rushing, not hiding, just observing. I lay there, in my hammock, cocooned in nylon and silence, flashlight gripped tight in my hand, straining to hear anything besides my own heartbeat. But there was nothing. No wind, no leaves crunching, no distant call of night creatures. Just the breathless stillness of a place holding itself back. Around midnight I heard it, soft footsteps, not animal-light but unmistakably human in rhythm. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. They didn't come close, didn't approach, but they moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, circling me like I was the center of a compass. I sat upright, the hammock swaying beneath me. My flashlight beam swept through the dark trees and returned only trunks and shadow. I called out, a simple, "Hello?" instantly regretting it. The footsteps stopped. The air grew impossibly, Still, I felt a tightness in my chest I hadn't felt since I was a kid hiding from nightmares. It was that same childhood dread, the kind that makes you pull the blanket over your head even though you know it won't help. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe another hiker had wandered off trail. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. But deep down I knew better. There was no talking, no light from a headlamp, no sounds of gear being unpacked, just silence, thick and watchful. Then came the whisper. Not a voice exactly, but the ghost of one. It carried no words, just breath and intention, like someone mouthing a story you weren't meant to hear. It was close. I spun toward the sound, flashlight trembling in my grip, and for a split second I saw it. A figure, not far, maybe 20 feet away, partially obscured by a thick tree. Tall, thin, still. The outline of what looked like a coat or cloak hung from its shoulders, and its head was bare, pale in the moonlight. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, half in shadow, half in memory. Then, like smoke-catching wind, it was gone. I sat there frozen, afraid to blink, pulse roaring in my ears. Nothing had made a sound, and yet every instinct I had was screaming to run. But where? I was miles from anyone, trapped on a mountain, soaked in old stories and older ghosts. And now one of them had noticed me. I didn't sleep that night, not even close. I lay rigid in the hammock, every muscle taut, ears straining for even the faintest sound, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the firelight that had long since died out. My flashlight lay on my chest, and my fingers ached from holding it so tightly. The figure I'd seen hadn't reappeared, but the pressure of its presence lingered in the clearing like a weight in the air. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving just far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Occasionally, there'd be a rustle of underbrush, or a snapping twig that made my breath catch, in my throat. But each time I pointed the light in that direction, I found nothing. The woods just swallowed the beam whole, like it wanted me to keep guessing. Around 3 a.m., I heard a whisper again, the same barely there breath of sound, rising out of the trees like steam from the ground. It was closer this time, behind me, and this time it was a voice. Not in any language I recognized, but deliberate, rhythmic, like it was chanting something old and long forgotten. I slowly turned in my hammock, angling the flashlight toward the sound, and then I saw him, or it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, facing me directly. Dressed in what looked like a tattered uniform from a different era, Civil War maybe, though time and shadow distorted the details. His face was pale and hollow, not glowing or gory like in the movies, just empty. Blank in a way that felt worse than anything grotesque. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He simply stared, like he'd been waiting for me to notice, him all along. And in that moment I realized something terrifying. I didn't feel like I was looking at a ghost. I felt like I was the one who'd intruded, like I had stumbled into a space that still belonged to him, that always had. I fumbled for my phone, not to take a photo. That thought didn't even occur to me, but just to check the time, to find an anchor in something real. 3:17 a.m. When I looked back up, the figure was gone. Not vanished in a dramatic blink and just not there anymore, as if he'd stepped sideways into the dark and the forest had welcomed him home. I stayed still for another hour, numb, disbelieving, waiting for some rational explanation to break through. But it never did. When the first signs of dawn began to streak the sky, I untied my hammock with shaking hands, shoved everything into my pack, and practically jogged back toward the main trail. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because some deep part of me was convinced that if I turned around I'd see him again, standing in the same spot, unchanged, watching as I ran from whatever history I'd walked into. The mountain was awake that night, and I had wandered into one of its memories, only it hadn't quite let go of what it remembered. And for a while, I wasn't sure it would let go of me either. The trail out of Blood Mountain felt longer than it had any right to. Every step away from that clearing should have brought me relief, but instead it only seemed to deepen the weight pressing on my chest. The trees felt too close, the sky too dim, and every snap of a twig behind me made me flinch. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the sense that I was still being followed, not physically, but by something older, something unseen. When I finally reached a trail junction that led down to a small supply station, I stopped and just stood there, hands on my knees, trying to slow my breathing. A couple of hikers passed me on their way up, cheerful and oblivious, and I remember staring at them like they were ghosts from a different world, a world where what I'd seen hadn't happened. I never told them what I'd experienced. What would I even say? That night I stayed at a rustic hostel in a nearby town. Bunk bed, hot food, company. The kind of place that should have made me feel safe again. But even surrounded by four walls and the dull hum of conversation, I couldn't escape the memory of that pale figure in the trees. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper. A kind of recognition, like I'd glimpsed a layer of the world we're not supposed to see. Like the veil had thinned just enough for me to peer through, and for something to peer back. I spent the rest of the night writing it all down, every detail I could remember. Not to convince anyone, but to remind myself it was real, that it happened. Since then I've kept hiking. The trail keeps calling, no matter how many ghosts I leave behind. But whenever I pass through a place heavy with silence, I slow down. I listen, because I know what it means now when the forest goes quiet. It means history is close and not everything buried out there stays forgotten. Story 4. The Murder Shelter. I was about 2 weeks into my through hike on the Appalachian Trail when I rolled into a small town not far from Duncan. The day had been long, humid and quiet, the kind of stretch where your thoughts loop endlessly, with each mile. I stopped at a roadside picnic area to rest and refill water when I noticed a group of older women sitting around a pair of weathered tables. They looked like locals, sun-worn faces, loose cardigans, the kind of calm you only get from living in one place your whole life. When they saw me, they waved me over, offered me a sandwich, asked if I was hiking north or south. It was all friendly at first, the usual trail talk, but then one of them asked where I planned to spend the night. I told them about the nearby shelter, an older one, tucked a few miles off the main stretch, just before the descent into Duncan. I'd read about it in my guidebook. Rustic, remote, but still maintained. The moment I said the name, their energy shifted. They went quiet, glanced at each other. Then one said gently, "You should push on to town tonight." Another chimed in with the same advice. No details, no reasoning, just a quiet insistence that I avoided. When I asked why, they deflected, saying the trail into Duncan wasn't bad, that I'd feel better in town, but something in their eyes stuck with me. Not fear exactly, but a kind of sadness, like they wanted to say more but couldn't, or wouldn't. Still, I was exhausted. My feet ached, and the idea of climbing the last few miles downhill in the dark didn't sit right, so I thanked them, hoisted my pack, and decided I'd stick to the plan. Looking back, that was the last truly peaceful moment of the day. The trail to the shelter turned out to be rougher than I expected. It peeled off the main route and dropped steeply through a series of switchbacks, each one more eroded than the last. Tree roots jutted out like skeletal fingers, and I stumbled more than once as I picked my way downhill. The sun was already disappearing behind the ridgeline, bleeding orange through the trees, and by the time I saw the shelter through the undergrowth, the forest had gone still. Not silent exactly, but heavy, like the air had thickened, pressing inward. The structure itself looked ancient. Two squat wooden lean-tos sat at opposite ends of a small clearing, their beams warped with age, their roofs sagging just enough to make you wonder how long they had left. A newer shelter stood off to one side, still under construction, with rough-hewn timbers and hand-carved faces etched into the support beams. The carvings unsettled me in a way I couldn't put into words. They weren't threatening exactly, just too detailed, too watchful. I walked past the new structure and chose one of the older shelters, more out of habit than comfort. Inside, the floor was nothing more than a line of rounded logs laid side by side, uneven and awkward to lie on. The musty smell of damp wood and age clung to everything. I dropped my pack, unrolled my sleeping pad, and tried not to overthink the place. After making a quick dinner, I sat outside for a while, listening. There were no owls, no rustling in the leaves, just the occasional groan of the trees swaying in the breeze. Every so often, one of the shelters would creak loudly, like it was shifting in place. Not unusual for old buildings, but each sound made me jump. The deeper the night fell, the more I felt the weight of those women's words return to me. You should really head into town. I couldn't shake it. I kept glancing at the woods, as if someone might appear, like I was waiting for a figure to step out and explain the sense of wrongness crawling under my skin. I turned on my headlamp and took a slow walk around the clearing. No signs of animals, no distant flash of other hikers' lights, not even a beer can or old fire ring. It felt untouched, almost too clean, like no one had stayed here in a long time. The wind picked up, and something about the sound it made through the beams of the new shelter sent a chill up my spine. It almost sounded like voices, low, drawn out, indistinct murmuring. I paused, heart thudding, but when I turned off the headlamp to listen, there was only wind again. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk past those carved faces. Their eyes, or what passed for them, seemed to catch what little light was left and reflect it faintly, not in the way of glossy wood, but like something watching back. I returned to my shelter and lay down, but sleep didn't come. I'd close, my eyes only to snap them open at every little sound. At one point I was sure I heard soft footsteps in the leaves nearby, slow and deliberate, circling. I sat up, clutching my knife, straining to hear, but it stopped the moment I moved, and then silence again. I stayed that way until the first light crept over the ridge, stiff from lying still, stomach knotted. I packed my gear in record time, barely touched breakfast. I didn't relax until I was halfway back up the trail, climbing fast, lungs burning. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd spent the night somewhere I absolutely wasn't supposed to be. It wasn't until I reached Duncan and reconnected to cell service that the pieces began to fall into place, and with them, the bottom dropped out of my stomach. I'd stopped at a local hiker-friendly cafe to grab breakfast and update my next resupply contact. I casually mentioned the old shelter I'd stayed in the night before, still feeling off about the whole experience but unsure why. The woman behind the counter froze mid-pour and looked at me like I'd said something terrible. "You actually slept up there?" she asked. I told her, yeah, just one night. She lowered her voice and leaned in. "You know what happened there, right?" I didn't. Not even close. She explained that a few years back, two southbound hikers had passed through Duncan and spent the night in that very same shelter. They'd met a man in a bar earlier that evening, nothing out of the ordinary. Shared trail stories, a few drinks. He seemed friendly enough, but later that night he followed them out into the woods, waited, then attacked them while they slept. One of the hikers died on the spot. The other crawled into the brush and bled out before morning. My hands went cold on my coffee mug. I could barely process what she was saying. That same clearing, those same sagging beams I'd slept under, those strange carvings had absorbed something far darker than mold and rot. A murder, an actual documented act of brutality committed under the cover of darkness and pine. I asked why there wasn't a sign or warning, and she shook her head. Most people around here know, locals, I mean. Hikers usually hear it from someone on the trail. Guess no one told you. I sat there in stunned silence, suddenly replaying every moment from the night before. The creaks, the footsteps, the cold, steady pressure that had wrapped around my chest for hours. That wasn't just paranoia, it wasn't just me overreacting to solitude. It was something deeper, an echo of what had been done there, soaked into the grain of the floorboards and the silence between tree trunks. I couldn't stop thinking about the women at the picnic table, how they'd tried to warn me without really saying it. Maybe they couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud. Maybe they thought I'd brush it off or laugh, the way hikers sometimes laugh off ghost stories and bear warnings until it's too late. But they knew. They carried that knowledge in their eyes, in the way their voices dipped when they told me to keep walking. I should have listened. I should have trusted that kind of instinct, the quiet kind passed between generations, the kind people don't need to explain because they feel it. Even now, I wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed a second. Night. If I hadn't been too unnerved to sleep, too alert to slip under completely. Would I have heard something else? Would I have seen a shape crouched outside the shelter? Or would I have simply joined the memory? Another cold, unspeaking presence etched into the stillness of those woods. It's a chilling thing, to realize how close you came to something you didn't understand. How easily a place can wear a mask of isolation when, in reality, it's hiding violence just beneath the surface. I stayed in Duncan an extra day, but I avoided the trailhead. I didn't want to be near that path again, not until I could breathe without seeing that clearing in my mind. When I finally left, the sun was rising and I looked back only once. Just a quick glance at the direction the trail disappeared into the trees. It looked ordinary, like any other patch of forest, but I knew better now. I knew that some places hold on to the worst parts of what people do, and they don't always let go. I didn't plan on returning to that stretch of trail. In fact, I avoided it for years, detouring any time a map hinted I might brush near that clearing again. But the Appalachian Trail has a strange way of pulling you back, rerouting your path until you find yourself facing the places you thought you'd buried. 3 years later, I found myself standing at the same fork, the memory still raw beneath. The surface. The forest looked different, older maybe, or just weathered by time and memory. A breeze rustled the canopy overhead, and for a moment it felt like the woods themselves remembered what had happened there. I moved slowly down the side trail, heart thudding as I reached the clearing. The 2 old shelters were gone, torn down completely, with only a few splintered boards left in the underbrush like bones picked clean. In their place stood a completed version of the newer shelter I'd seen being built years before. Fresh, wood, clean roof, sturdy walls, but those carved faces still remained, now dulled by weather and years of hikers brushing against them. Somehow that made them worse, like they'd been watching everything all along. There was a hiker sitting on the porch when I arrived, sipping from a dented canteen, and we got to talking the way strangers do out here, slowly, naturally, like we already shared something unspoken. Eventually, the conversation drifted to the shelter's history, and he mentioned the murders without hesitation. People say the land still feels off, he said, looking out toward the trees. Like it remembers. I nodded, unable to say much else. He left not long after, disappearing back into the trail, but I stayed for a while longer, sitting quietly in the shadow of the new structure. It looked safe, clean, ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what happened here wasn't gone, just covered up, like a scar beneath a fresh layer of skin. When I finally stood to leave, I traced one of the carved faces with my hand. The wood felt warm under my fingers, watching, listening. And I wondered if somewhere, just beyond, the tree line the past was still watching too. Story 5. The Ritual in the Hills. It was supposed to be one of those lazy evenings where the past and present blur together, the kind that only happen when you're back in your childhood stomping grounds, surrounded by old friends and fading sunlight. I was visiting my grandfather's place deep in the Appalachian Hills, a familiar patch of land nestled at the base of a densely wooded ridge. My two closest childhood friends, Rye and Kelsey, had dropped by unannounced, just like they used to. Before long, someone suggested we play a round of the old hide-and-seek game we invented as kids, a sprawling, half-chaotic version that used the entire hillside behind the homestead as our playground. It sounded stupid, juvenile even, but something about the idea felt right, nostalgic, comfortable. The ridge had always been a place of mystery when we were younger. Grandpa used to say the land had memory, that it listened when you moved through. It and whispered back if you knew how to hear. As a kid, I'd laughed that off, just one of his folksy superstitions. But standing there again, watching the sun melt behind the trees and feeling the cool breath of evening roll down the slope, I found myself remembering those words. Kelsey volunteered to be it, counting off loudly while Rye and I took off in opposite directions, our camouflage jackets half useless in the growing dusk. I bolted uphill, lungs burning with that strange cocktail of adrenaline and laughter. At the top, I ducked behind a scraggly thicket of bushes with a clear view of the yard, the porch light already flicking on. For a moment I just lay there catching my breath, heart pounding in my ears, and everything felt timeless, like we were kids again, hidden in the hush of the Appalachian woods, waiting for something magical or ridiculous to happen. But what happened next was neither. The first thing that pulled me out of the moment was the silence. Not the usual kind that falls when the sun sets, but a silence that felt layered, deliberate, like the forest had sucked all the air out of itself. No crickets, no birds, not even the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Just stillness. I shifted slightly behind the bushes, suddenly hyper-aware of how loud my breathing felt. Then I heard it, faint, rhythmic, and impossibly far away. A deep thump, thump, like the beat of a drum, echoing through the trees from somewhere farther. Up the ridge. I sat bolt upright, thinking it must be some distant event, maybe a festival or someone playing music on a portable speaker. But the sound didn't match anything casual. It was too ritualistic, slow, intentional. It echoed through the hills in a way that made my chest tighten with each beat. Rye must have heard it too, because a moment later, I saw him crouched farther down the slope, half hidden behind a tree, staring wide-eyed up the ridge. I caught his eye and he didn't say a word, just nodded once, confirming I wasn't imagining it. The drumming grew louder, and soon it was joined by something else, a faint wailing tone, high and wavering, almost like bagpipes, but slightly off. Like the melody didn't belong here, didn't belong now. It swelled and twisted through the trees, not in harmony with the drum, but dancing beside it, unsettling in its unpredictability. It wasn't music made to entertain. It was music meant to summon, to mark something. And the longer it went on, the more my body screamed for me to run, but we didn't. We just crouched there, paralyzed by something we couldn't see but could feel moving closer. Even Kelsey, who we assumed was still down by the house, must have heard it. Her flashlight beam swept erratically across the yard, pausing, then swinging upward toward the ridge as if searching for something beyond her view. That's when Rye started backing toward me, slow and careful, keeping his body low to the ground. We didn't need to speak. We had the same thought, the same sick feeling curling in our guts. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be heard by us. It wasn't for us. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the music stopped. Not in a gradual fade, but like someone had yanked the sound out of the air. The silence that followed was even worse than before, charged, brittle, like something was about to break. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Rye leaned in close and whispered, "We need to go, now." As we stood, movement caught my eye farther up the ridge, subtle shapes weaving between the trees. Shadows, figures. I couldn't count how many, but they moved with intent, forming a loose circle in the clearing above. One of them carried something long, a staff or banner, I couldn't tell. Another held what might have been the source of the pipes. Their heads were covered in cloth, their motions slow, ceremonial. We didn't wait to see more. Rye tugged my sleeve, and we broke into a crouched run, crashing downhill through underbrush and fallen branches. Every branch that snapped underfoot felt like a flare in the night, like we were drawing attention with each step. The trees blurred around us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had the awful feeling that if I turned, I'd see those figures starting toward us, not running, not chasing, but following, certain we had heard something we were never meant to carry with us. We burst out of the tree line at full speed, half tumbling down the last stretch of slope, hearts hammering, legs aching, the world narrowing into a blur of panic and moonlight. Kelsey was already standing in the yard when we reached it, her face pale and stricken under the porch light, flashlight still clenched in her hand, but pointing uselessly at the ground. She didn't ask what happened. She could hear it too now. The drumming had started again, louder, nearer, the beat more frantic, more urgent, like something had been stirred up and now refused to go back to sleep. Grandpa stepped out onto the porch just as we reached the door, holding an old lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other. He didn't yell or ask questions. He just looked at us, looked toward the ridge, and said in a low, steady voice, "Get inside now." We slammed the door shut behind us and dropped the heavy bar into place, all of us breathing like we'd run from a wildfire. Grandpa moved through the house with practiced calm, checking windows, switching off lights, keeping his eyes on the tree line outside. The drums didn't stop. They throbbed through the hills in a rhythm that was no longer distant. They were here, pounding through the ground, pulsing in our chests like second heartbeats. Every now and then the wailing returned, not bagpipes anymore, but something like voices rising in song or chant, the syllables long and warped, vibrating through the walls like they came from the wood itself. None of us spoke much. We just sat there in the living room, backs to the walls, staring at the windows we didn't dare approach. At one point, Rye whispered, "They were dancing," his voice flat, hollow. "I think we saw a ceremony." Grandpa didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked grimly resigned, like something he'd hoped never to face again had finally caught up. "Some folks out here keep old ways," he said, barely louder than the beat still echoing through the dark. "Mixed traditions. Scottish, maybe native. Hard to say where one ends and another begins." He nodded toward the slope behind the house. "They used to say there were families who never left these hills, didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who stumbled onto their rituals." The implication hung in the air like smoke. We hadn't just seen something strange. We'd interrupted something sacred, or forbidden. For a long time we just waited, the three of us huddled close, Grandpa keeping his post near the window. And then, just before sunrise, it stopped. No fade, no warning. The drumming and chanting simply ceased, replaced by the sudden sound of wind moving through the trees again, birds beginning their morning calls like nothing had happened. Grandpa slowly lowered the rifle. Kelsey exhaled a breath she'd clearly been holding for hours. I stood, legs numb, and peeked out the front window. The yard was empty. No figures, no fires, but something was different. The slope looked marked, like the trees themselves had shifted, like the line between our world and whatever we'd seen had been thinned, stretched to the point of tearing. I didn't mention it to the others, but just beyond the last tree before the clearing, I spotted something fluttering, a piece of cloth snagged on a branch. It was patterned, red and green, like tartan. We didn't go back up the ridge. Not then, not ever. Grandpa promised he'd report it to the ranger station, though he didn't sound confident anything would come of it. Some things, he said, don't like being talked about too loud. That night we stayed close to the house, all the lights on, windows locked, though deep down we knew locks didn't matter. Whatever we'd seen had its own rules, older than the park boundaries, older than maps, maybe older than language. We hadn't escaped it. We'd just been allowed to leave. The next morning felt unreal, like we'd all shared the same fever dream and were now pretending it hadn't happened. The sunlight came in soft through the windows, dappling the hardwood floors with warm gold. And for a moment I almost convinced myself the night had been a trick of the dark. Adrenaline, nerves, maybe an overactive imagination stoked by old legends and shadows. But then I looked at Rye, still pacing the room without a word, and at Kelsey, who sat with her coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the ridge outside. And I knew we'd all seen the same thing. We didn't talk much during breakfast. Grandpa was already at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of worn field notebooks, maps, and clipped-out newspaper articles I'd never seen before. He didn't offer them to us. He didn't need to. His silence was explanation enough. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, not in these hills. Later, we retraced our steps in the daylight, needing to see it with new eyes, needing proof that the world still made sense. The trail was quiet again, almost too normal, but we found the clearing, and in its center was a wide circle of scorched earth, as if a fire had burned there recently. Blackened branches were scattered like bones, and in the ash Rye found more tartan scraps, red fibers threaded with green, singed but unmistakable. Kelsey found a faint outline of footprints far larger than ours, moving not away from the circle but around it, a slow orbit, a ritual. We didn't linger. We didn't speak on the hike back. That evening, when the sun began to sink behind the ridge once more, none of us even joked about stepping outside. We stayed in, doors locked, lights low, waiting again. But the drums never came. No chants, no flickering shadows in the trees, just silence. And still it didn't feel like safety. It felt like the hills were simply watching now, remembering us, just as we would remember them. Because the truth is, once you witness something like that, something that wasn't meant for you, it never truly lets you go. Story 6. The White Jeep. The plan was simple. Drive from Michigan to New York City, pick up my friend who needed help moving, and head back west in one long, caffeine-fueled push through the Appalachians. I'd done solo road trips before. Late-night highways, sleeping at rest stops, greasy food and sketchy bathrooms, nothing new. But this time felt different from the moment I hit Pennsylvania. The landscape changed, narrowing into thick ridges and shadowed valleys, and the sky seemed permanently overcast, like the mountains were pressing in from all sides. Even the air felt heavier. I told myself it was just fatigue. I'd barely slept. The night before, pulled over at a rest area to catch an hour or two of uncomfortable half-sleep. Every car door slam or distant footstep outside had snapped me awake, heart racing, convinced someone was watching me. Paranoia, I thought. Just nerves. After I picked up my friend in New York, we were both eager to escape the city's chaos. We took backroads west to avoid traffic, hoping to find a big store lot somewhere in western Pennsylvania where we could rest overnight. Something well lit, maybe a 24-hour Walmart. And we did. But that's where things started to feel off. The lot was mostly empty when we arrived, save for 2 vehicles parked too far out from the entrance, both with dark tinted windows and engines still running. I told myself not to overthink it, but every time I looked up, one of those cars seemed a little closer. My friend noticed it too. She nudged my arm and whispered, "Is it just me, or are they edging toward us?" That's when I felt it, that unmistakable gut-level tightening. Not fear exactly, but something primal, a warning. We didn't wait. We got back on the road, and that's when the white Jeep showed up. We didn't talk much as we pulled out of that parking lot, both of us too keyed up to joke about it like we normally would have. I remember gripping the wheel tighter than usual, eyes flicking constantly between the mirrors and the road ahead. We chalked it up to nerves, to the eerie vibe of being in unfamiliar territory after dark. But a few miles down the highway, I noticed headlights behind us. Too far to make out details, but just close enough to keep pace. At first I dismissed it. Highways at night are full of coincidences, but then the car switched lanes when I did, slowed down when I slowed, sped up when I pushed past the speed limit. My friend noticed too. She leaned forward, peering out the side mirror. "That's the Jeep," she said quietly. "Same one from the lot." We passed exit after exit, and it didn't budge. I took an off-ramp suddenly, hoping to throw it off. The Jeep followed. That was when it really hit. We weren't imagining it. We were being tailed. My friend scrambled to pull up a map on her phone, trying to find a back way into a town, or a gas station with people, lights, anything. But most of what surrounded us was shadowy stretches of forest and narrow 2-lane blacktop. We ducked into a small town center, looped around a few empty side streets, and pulled into a well-lit gas station. For a few seconds we sat in silence, hearts pounding. The Jeep didn't follow. We thought we'd lost it. Maybe we were being paranoid after all. But just as we started to relax, headlights swept into the lot. Same white Jeep. Same tinted windows. It parked 2 spaces down from us, engine idling. We couldn't see the driver, but we felt them. That awful sensation of being watched, like every move we made was being catalogued. I didn't wait. I threw the car into gear and peeled out, tires screeching as we shot back onto the main road. This time the Jeep hesitated for only a second before following again. It tailed us with terrifying precision, never too close, never too far, always just enough to keep us seen. My mind raced with possibilities. Stalker, trafficker, some unhinged local playing a sick game. But none of them felt right. This wasn't road rage or some random encounter. It felt like we had been chosen. We drove for nearly an hour through winding back roads, hoping every turn might shake them. At one point I killed my headlights briefly, coasting through a downhill stretch just to break line of sight. It worked for a few minutes. But then, just as we approached a lonely intersection, the Jeep reappeared from a side road, like it knew where we were going before we did. We were deep in the hills now, the kind of place where cell signal blinked in and out, where every house sat dark and distant behind walls of trees. I remember thinking, if we stop, no one's going to help us. No one's even going to know. The fear stopped being sharp. It settled into something cold and quiet, a numbness in my chest that came with realization. We were being herded. This wasn't random. This was planned. We didn't know the rules, but we were already playing the game. I don't remember the exact moment panic gave way to strategy, when raw fear started to calcify into something colder, more focused. Maybe it was when the GPS completely dropped out, and we found ourselves driving blind through a web of unlit mountain roads. Maybe it was when we crested a hill and saw the Jeep already waiting at the bottom, its headlights glowing like twin eyes in the mist. But something shifted. I stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about survival. My friend was trembling, trying to keep her phone alive long enough to load a map, any map, but the signal was gone and the battery was dying. We were on our own, no cops, no crowds, just us, a tank that was slowly bleeding dry, and a driver who clearly knew this land better than we ever could. And still they didn't confront us, never pulled up beside us or blocked our path, just followed, unyielding with the kind of patience that felt more threatening than any aggression. I took another sharp turn onto a smaller road, more a gravel path than anything else, flanked by tall pines that swallowed the last of the moonlight. The road narrowed to a single lane, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. That's when we saw it, an old wooden sign, weathered and leaning at an angle pointing toward a faded name, some forgotten town, or maybe just a dead end. But the Jeep wasn't behind us anymore, not in the mirror, not in the distance, just gone. I slowed the car, breath caught in my throat, and glanced over at my friend. She didn't speak, but her hand gripped the door handle like she was ready to bolt. "Maybe it finally gave up," she whispered, but we both knew better. Something like that doesn't just give up. Still, we pressed forward, the only option. That felt less terrifying than turning back. The road wound downhill into a narrow ravine where the trees arched overhead like a tunnel. Then the car sputtered, a cough in the engine that made my stomach drop. I looked at the gas gauge. Empty. Impossible. We hadn't gone far enough to drain it, and I'd filled up only a few hours before picking up my friend. I coasted to a stop on instinct, pulling to the shoulder just as the engine died. Complete stillness, no wind, no bugs, just the tick of the cooling engine and the suffocating realization. We were stranded. I tried the key again. Nothing. The lights dimmed, dashboard flickered, and then even that faded. The battery was dead. Somehow, everything was dead. That's when the headlights reappeared, not from behind, from ahead. At the far end of the ravine, framed perfectly in the tunnel of trees, the white Jeep idled silently, its lights cutting through the dark like a blade. It didn't move, didn't inch forward or rev the engine. It just sat there, as if to remind us that it had always been in control. We were never being chased, we were being led. My friend broke. She started sobbing quietly, covering her mouth with both hands like she couldn't bear to make noise. I felt frozen, hand still on the E, wheel unsure if driving forward, if we could drive forward, one would have made a difference. The road ahead might as well have been a cliff. That Jeep, with its blank windows and perfect stillness, felt less like a vehicle and more like a sentinel, waiting to see what we'd do next. For a long moment, we stared at it, and then its headlights blinked out, not dimmed, not turned off. They just vanished, like someone had cut the cord between presence and reality. When I blinked, the Jeep was gone. We jumped out, shivering in the sudden cold, scanning the ravine with our flashlight. Nothing. No tire tracks, no engine noise, fading into the hills. Just the sound of our own breathing and the haunting sense that we'd been allowed to leave. For now. We waited until the first pink traces of morning touched the treetops before we dared move again. Neither of us had slept. We stayed in the car with the doors locked, flashlights off, every muscle tense, flinching at every sound, a snapping twig, a shifting breeze. But the Jeep never came back. And when daylight finally returned, it was as if the entire forest exhaled. Birds began to call, insects buzzed, the oppressive stillness dissolved. In that new light, the road ahead looked just like any other, narrow, cracked, draped in mist, but no longer sinister. We stepped out to check the vehicle, and somehow, inexplicably, the battery was working again. The gas gauge read a quarter, tank not empty, like the car had been caught in something and now just as suddenly released. I didn't speak as I started the engine. It turned over without hesitation, purring like it always had. My friend buckled in silently, eyes still. scanning the woods. We didn't say a word until we hit the main highway. Even then, all we could do was trade glances, trying to wrap language around something that didn't seem to want to be understood. Was it someone? Something? A warning? A trap? None of the explanations we tossed around held water. It hadn't been a game, not a prank. The patterns were too precise, the silence too calculated. We both knew, deep down, that we'd brushed up against something with intention. Something that had watched us from behind those black-tinted windows and decided at the last moment to let us go. To this day, I still think about that Jeep. Every time I see white paint glinting in the corner of my mirror, I tense. Every rest, stop every dimly lit parking lot, I wonder if it's there again, watching, waiting. We never figured out what it wanted or why it picked us. Maybe we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe we saw something we were never meant to. But one thing's certain, I don't take the quiet stretches of the Appalachians for granted anymore. Some roads don't just lead you somewhere. Some roads call you, and if you're not careful, they don't let you back. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.